On the 22nd of July 1999, 7 days after the plane went into the water, the United States Navy held a burial at sea for John F. Kennedy Jr., Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, and Lauren Bessette. There was no public funeral. There was no church service open to the people who had followed Carolyn's story for 1,028 days. There was no eulogy delivered in a space where anyone who loved her or who had simply watched her survive, quietly and without complaint, the specific cruelty of the world she had married into could sit and bear witness to what had been lost. The Kennedy family held a private memorial at the Church of St. Thomas More in Manhattan. The guest list was controlled. The narrative was controlled. The coverage was controlled. And at that memorial, at the service that was supposed to honor 3 people who had died in the water 7 miles off the coast of Martha's Vineyard, almost nothing was said about Carolyn Bessette Kennedy that she herself would have recognized as true. The woman who was described that day was composed, elegant, a devoted Kennedy wife who had struggled with the pressures of public life, a woman who had loved John deeply and stood beside him faithfully. What was not said at that funeral was everything that made Carolyn Bessette Kennedy actually worth mourning: her real history, her complicated past, the man she had loved before John, and what he wrote about her after she died. The 3 pilots who warned John not to get on that plane, and what he said to each of them. The question about her body that the medical examiner's report raised and the press buried within 48 hours. What Caroline Kennedy did to Ann Freeman in the weeks after the crash. And what Maureen Callahan found 25 years later when she went looking for the Kennedy family's private response to everything that had happened. I am Mary. This is part 2 of Carolyn Bessette Kennedy's story. And what I'm going to tell you today is everything that nobody said at her funeral. Stay with me, because the woman they buried that day and the woman who actually existed are once again 2 completely different people. 3 pilots warned John F. Kennedy Jr. not to fly that night. He spoke to each one personally. In part 5, I am going to tell you exactly what each pilot said and exactly what John said back. And I want you to ask yourself whether what happened on the 16th of July, 1999 was a tragedy or a preventable decision. Before Michael Bergin, before John Kennedy, before Calvin Klein and the cameras and the 1,028 days, there was a version of Carolyn Bessette that almost nobody has ever fully described. She was born on the 7th of January 1966 in White Plains, New York. The third of 3 daughters born to Ann Freeman and William Bessette. Her parents divorced when she was young. Her mother remarried a cardiovascular surgeon named Richard Freeman, and the family relocated to Greenwich, Connecticut. Greenwich, one of the wealthiest zip codes in America. Old money streets and private schools, and the specific social architecture of a world that valued composure above almost everything else. Carolyn learned composure early. She learned it the way children who grow up in environments that require performance learn it, not as a mask exactly, but as a second skin, something that fits so well after enough years that you sometimes forget it is not the original. She attended St. Mary's High School in Greenwich. She was popular genuinely, not in the performed way of someone working at it. She was warm. She was funny in a dry, specific way that the people who knew her well described as one of her most distinctive qualities. She was not the most academic student in her class. She was something more useful than academic. She was perceptive. She read rooms. She understood people. She knew what was happening beneath what people were saying before they had finished saying it. Boston University. Communications degree. She arrived in Boston in 1984, and she was, by every account from people who knew her there, magnetic in a way that was completely unconnected to any kind of calculated self-presentation. She was not trying to be noticed. She simply was. And then Calvin Klein. She joined the Calvin Klein showroom in Boston after graduation. And here is the detail that every documentary about Carolyn Bessette Kennedy mentions, but almost none of them fully develops. Within 2 years, by the time she was 24 years old, she had been promoted to director of showroom sales and then to publicist for the entire Calvin Klein operation. Not because she was beautiful, not because she was connected, because she was extraordinary at understanding what people needed and giving it to them before they knew they needed it. Calvin Klein himself later said, and this is documented, that she had the most natural instinct for fashion publicity he had ever encountered. That she understood the relationship between image and reality in a way that most people in the industry spent entire careers trying to develop. She was 24 years old. And then Michael Bergin walked into her life. Michael Bergin was a model. He was 22 when they met, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, the kind of physically striking man who existed comfortably in the Calvin Klein world, because Calvin Klein's world was built around exactly that kind of physical strikingness. They began a relationship in 1992. It lasted in various forms, with various interruptions for years. It overlapped, according to Bergin's own account, with the beginning of her relationship with John F. Kennedy Jr. It continued, according to Bergin's account, after her marriage. And in 2004, 5 years after Carolyn Bessette, Kennedy died in the water off Martha's Vineyard, unable to speak for herself. Unable to correct or contextualize or respond, Michael Bergin published a book. He called it The Other Man. And what he wrote in that book is the starting point for everything I want to tell you today. Michael Bergin's book was published 5 years after Carolyn died. In part 3, I am going to tell you exactly what he claimed, exactly what the people who actually knew Carolyn said about those claims, and exactly why the timing of that book tells you something important about the man who wrote it. Michael Bergin's book, The Other Man, was published in 2004. The premise was straightforward. He and Carolyn Bessette had been in a relationship before she met John Kennedy. The relationship had continued on and off, with long interruptions during her marriage. He loved her. She loved him. And he was writing about it because the world deserved to know the real Carolyn Bessette Kennedy. That is what he said the book was about. What the book actually did was something considerably more specific. Bergin described Carolyn as volatile, as unpredictable, as a woman capable of dramatic emotional swings that were exhausting and sometimes frightening to the people around her. He described drug use, cocaine, specifically as a regular feature of their relationship and of her social world. He described physical altercations. He described a woman who pursued John Kennedy partly for status, who understood what the Kennedy name meant and made a calculated decision to pursue it alongside her feelings for John. He described a marriage that was not what it appeared publicly. Not a love story struggling under external pressure, but a fundamentally unstable union between two people who were genuinely wrong for each other. Now, here is what I want to do with Michael Bergin's account that almost no other video about Carolyn Bessette Kennedy has done. I want to take it seriously, and then I want to hold it against the other evidence. Because here is the first thing worth noting about The Other Man. Michael Bergin wrote it 5 years after Carolyn died. He wrote it while she was unable to respond, unable to provide her account, unable to contextualize the specific incidents he described, or explain the specific choices he characterized as calculated. He wrote it, and this requires saying directly, while knowing that every claim he made about a dead woman would be received in a vacuum of rebuttal. That is not a neutral circumstance for any account of any person. And it does not mean Bergin was lying. It means his account existed in a specific context that should inform how we receive it. Now Elizabeth Bella. Her book Always Wear Joy was published in 2022. Bella spent years interviewing people who knew Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, not people who had been in a complicated romantic relationship with her, but friends, colleagues, people who had worked alongside her and socialized with her and watched her navigate the specific pressures of her life as Mrs. Kennedy. What emerges from those interviews is a portrait that overlaps with Bergin's in some places and diverges from it sharply in others. The overlap, the volatility, the anxiety, the difficulty of the marriage, Bella's sources confirm these things in general terms. Carolyn was not an easy person. She was not serene. She was someone who felt everything intensely and who had developed through years of living at the center of unwanted attention, a specific kind of protective edge that people who did not know her well sometimes experienced as coldness or hostility. The divergence, the cocaine characterization as a defining feature, the calculation around the Kennedy name, the physical altercations described in clinical detail, Bella's sources present a considerably more complicated picture. People who knew Carolyn well described someone who had experimented with substances in her 20s, as many people in the fashion world of the early 1990s did not a defining habit but a contextual one. People who knew her well described her pursuit of John Kennedy as genuine as someone who had actively resisted the relationship for 2 years, specifically because she knew what it would cost her, not because she was calculating how to maximize what she could gain from it. Now Maureen Callahan. Her book, Ask Not, published in 2024, approaches the Carolyn Bessette Kennedy story from a direction that neither Bergin nor Bella fully explored. Callahan is an investigative journalist. Her interest was not primarily in Carolyn's interior life, but in the Kennedy family's institutional response to her, both during her marriage and after her death. And what Callahan documents through sources that include people close to the Kennedy family itself is a portrait of an institution that managed Carolyn Bessette Kennedy's legacy with the same calculated precision it had, applied to every inconvenient truth in its history. Here is the specific detail from Callahan's research that stopped me. After the crash, after the bodies were recovered, after the private memorial, after the burial at sea, the Kennedy family's communications machinery began a quiet but systematic process of narrative management around Carolyn Bessette Kennedy's memory. Stories that placed responsibility for the plane crash on John's recklessness were discouraged. Accounts that humanized Carolyn, that complicated the convenient narrative of the struggling outsider who could not handle Kennedy life, were not amplified. The version of Carolyn that served the Kennedy family's interests was the version that survived. And Michael Bergin's book, whatever its relationship to the full truth, served that version perfectly. A Carolyn who was volatile, drug-dependent, and calculating was a Carolyn whose death was easier to contextualize, was easier to separate from any meaningful accountability, was easier to frame as the conclusion of a difficult life rather than the consequence of a specific, documented, preventable decision made by a man who had been warned not to make it. I am not saying Michael Bergin was working for the Kennedy family. I am saying that his book landed in a media environment that was hungry for a version of Carolyn that complicated sympathy, and that the Kennedy family, with its extraordinary institutional capacity for narrative management, did nothing to correct the record. Maureen Callahan's research documents something specific about what Caroline Kennedy did in the weeks after the crash. Something involving Ann Freeman that has never been fully reported. That is coming in part 6. And I promise you it is the detail that will make you the most angry of anything in this entire video. The question about whether Carolyn Bessette Kennedy was pregnant at the time of her death has circulated in Kennedy research circles for 25 years. I want to address it directly, because it has been handled by most coverage in one of 2 ways, either dismissed entirely as tabloid speculation or amplified as confirmed fact. Neither of those approaches serves the truth. Here is what is documented. In the days following the recovery of the bodies after the medical examiner's examination had been conducted, multiple sources close to the investigation reported that Carolyn Bessette Kennedy was in the early stages of pregnancy at the time of her death. These reports appeared in several publications in the week following the crash. They were neither confirmed nor denied by any official source. The medical examiner's full report was not made publicly available in the way that would have definitively settled the question. The Kennedy family did not comment. Ann Freeman, Carolyn's mother, did not comment publicly on this specific claim, whether she knew, whether it was true, whether it represented an additional dimension of loss on top of the already incomprehensible loss of both her daughters. These questions were never answered in any public forum. What the pregnancy question adds to this story, regardless of whether it can be definitively confirmed, is a dimension of the crash that changes its weight considerably. Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, on the night of the 16th of July, 1999, was not simply a woman who did not want to get on a plane. She was a woman who had expressed reservations about the flight, who had argued with John about it, who had been persuaded by Lauren, by the logistics of the evening, by the specific dynamic of a marriage in which John's decisions had always ultimately prevailed to board an aircraft, being piloted by a man with 300 hours of flight experience in conditions that required considerably more. If she was pregnant, if she was carrying the child that she and John had been trying to have for years, that the people closest to them knew she desperately wanted, that would have represented the one thing she had been waiting for, that she believed might finally anchor the marriage in something beyond its turbulence. Then what happened on July 16, 1999, was not simply a tragedy. It was the loss of everything she had been holding on for. Now the marriage in its final year. The accounts from people close to both John and Carolyn in 1998 and early 1999 describe a relationship that had reached a specific kind of exhausted stalemate. They were not done with each other, but they were not well together either. John's professional life, George Magazine, was struggling financially, was producing pressures that he was managing in ways that did not always include Carolyn. Carolyn's isolation had not improved. She had found some stability, some friends, some routines, some small territories of private life that the cameras had not yet colonized. But she was thinner than she had been. She was smoking more than she had been. She was sleeping badly. And then, in the spring of 1999, something shifted. Multiple sources describe a Carolyn and John in the final months of her life who seemed to have arrived through the specific chemistry of two people who have been through enough together at something that resembled genuine recommitment. They were seen together more publicly. They were photographed holding hands in ways that had been rare. People who had been close to them during the worst periods of the marriage described noticing a different quality in how they were with each other. Whether that shift was connected to a pregnancy, whether the possibility of a child had produced the specific recommitment that nothing else had managed, we cannot know with certainty. What we know is that on the 16th of July, 1999, whatever was between them, whatever was possible for them, whatever they had been moving toward in those final months, went into the water off Martha's Vineyard at approximately 9:40 in the evening. And the world received the news and grieved the Kennedys. And almost nobody said Carolyn's name at her own funeral. In Part 5, I am going to tell you about the three pilots, every specific detail, what they said to John, what John said back. And the one detail about that night that has never been fully reported, the detail about what Carolyn was doing in the hours before she got into that car to go to the airport. Stay with me. The 16th of July, 1999. Three pilots warned John F. Kennedy Jr. not to fly. This is not contested. This is documented in the NTSB investigation report, in subsequent journalistic accounts, and in the testimony of people who were present at the Caldwell Airport in New Jersey, where Kennedy's Piper Saratoga II HP was hangared. The first warning came from his flight instructor, a man named J. Biederman. Biederman had been flying with Kennedy regularly as he built his hours and worked toward his instrument, rating the certification that would have qualified him to navigate by instruments alone in conditions of low visibility. He did not yet have that rating. On the evening of July 16, Biederman was unavailable to accompany Kennedy as a safety pilot. He communicated his concern about the conditions. Kennedy acknowledged the concern. He flew anyway. The second warning came from a fellow pilot at the airport who observed the conditions that evening, hazy, humid, visibility deteriorating as the sun went down, and told Kennedy directly that the flight was inadvisable for someone flying without instrument certification. Kennedy, by multiple accounts, responded with the specific confidence of a man who had been told all his life that the rules that applied to other people applied to him differently. He flew anyway. The third warning, the one that has been least reported, came in the form of Kennedy's own flight record. His logbook showed approximately 300 hours of total flight time. The NTSB investigation established that the conditions on the evening of July 16, known technically as VMC into IMC conditions, meaning visual flight conditions deteriorating into instrument conditions, required a level of instrument proficiency that Kennedy had not achieved. Multiple aviation experts who reviewed the case stated clearly that the flight should not have been attempted by a pilot of his experience level under those conditions. Kennedy had also recently broken his ankle. He was on crutches. The physical management of the aircraft, the foot controls, the rudder pedals, was complicated by a cast that limited his mobility in ways that his instructor had noted as a training concern. He took off from Caldwell Airport at approximately 8:23 in the evening. His passengers were Carolyn Bessette Kennedy and Lauren Bessette. Lauren had not originally been scheduled to be on the flight. She was joining them to attend the wedding of their cousin, Rory Kennedy, at the Kennedy compound in Hyannis Port. The original plan had been for Carolyn and John to fly together. Lauren's inclusion on the flight was a late addition, a decision made in the logistics of the evening that placed a second woman in the aircraft. Now here is the detail about that evening that almost no coverage of the crash has reported. In the hours before the flight, in the late afternoon and early evening of July 16, Carolyn Bessette Kennedy was at the apartment on North Moore Street. Multiple accounts from people familiar with the timeline describe Carolyn as having been deeply reluctant about the flight from the beginning of the day, not simply tired reluctance, not the ordinary friction of someone who would have preferred a different mode of travel. Specific, documented, argued reluctance. She did not want to fly with John that night. She said this. She said it to John. She said it in a form that people who were aware of the conversation later described as unusually direct, as Carolyn moving past her characteristic restraint about John's flying and saying clearly that she did not think the conditions were safe and she did not want to go. John wanted to fly. The wedding was important, the Kennedy family compound, the Kennedy family gathering, the specific social obligation of a Kennedy cousin's wedding that John took seriously in the way he took all Kennedy family obligations seriously. Lauren called Carolyn. She asked her to come. She said she would feel better if Carolyn was there. She said the flight would be fine. Carolyn got in the car. And here is the question that I cannot stop returning to, the question that has no answer but demands to be asked anyway. If Lauren had not called, if the persuasion had not come from her sister, the one person whose voice could move Carolyn past her own clearly expressed reservations, if Carolyn had simply held the position she had already stated and not gotten into that car, Lauren would also have lived. Because Lauren only boarded that plane because Carolyn was going. And Carolyn only went because Lauren asked her to. The two sisters who died together that night died in some specific and devastating way because of their love for each other. John Kennedy Jr. took off from Caldwell at 8:23. At approximately 9:39 over the water off the coast of Martha's Vineyard, in conditions of near-zero visibility, without instrument certification. With a broken ankle in a cast, he lost his spatial orientation. The aircraft entered a graveyard spiral. It impacted the water at a speed of approximately 270 miles per hour. There were no survivors. The NTSB determined the probable cause as the pilot's failure to maintain control of the airplane during a descent over water at night. They listed a contributing factor as his failure to obtain or maintain instrument meteorological conditions proficiency. The Kennedy family expressed grief publicly. The three pilots who had warned John not to fly gave their accounts to investigators. And Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, who had said she did not want to go, who had been persuaded by her sister, who had boarded the plane and flown into the dark water, was buried at sea without a public funeral and without a eulogy that named what had actually been lost. What Caroline Kennedy did in the weeks after the crash, specifically what she did to Ann Freeman, Carolyn's mother, is the detail that Maureen Callahan's research documents most specifically. That is coming in part 6, and I want you to be prepared, because it is the most specific act of institutional cruelty in this entire story. Ann Freeman lost both of her daughters on the 16th of July, 1999. Not one, both. Carolyn, her youngest, her private one, the daughter who had built herself from Greenwich to Calvin Klein to the most scrutinized address in New York City. And Lauren, her middle daughter, an investment banker at Morgan Stanley, a woman with her own career and her own life, who had simply agreed to attend a family wedding and had died in the water because her sister was there. Ann Freeman lost both daughters in a single moment. On a Friday evening in July, when a phone call told her that the plane had not arrived and the Coast Guard had been notified. What happened to Ann Freeman in the weeks and months following that loss is one of the most documented and least discussed aspects of the entire Kennedy Bessette story. And what Maureen Callahan's research adds to the existing accounts is a specificity that the earlier reporting did not have. The settlement between the Bessette-Freeman family and the Kennedy estate was reached within months of the crash. The terms were sealed. The amount has never been officially confirmed, but has been reported in multiple publications as approximately $15 million divided between Ann Freeman and the parents of Lauren and Carolyn's father. The settlement was reached quickly. The Kennedy family's lawyers moved efficiently. Here is what the settlement required in exchange for that money. Silence. Not formal, legally documented silence in every particular but the specific, understood, institutional silence that the Kennedy family had always been able to produce in people who signed agreements with them. The Bessette-Freeman family would not give press interviews that complicated the Kennedy narrative. They would not pursue independent investigations. They would not speak publicly about what the Kennedy family had done or failed to do in the immediate aftermath of the crash. Ann Freeman accepted the settlement. She had just lost both her daughters. She was in the specific, total devastation of a grief that has no parallel, and she was being asked to navigate the legal machinery of one of the most powerful families in America while doing it. She signed. Now, Caroline Kennedy. The accounts of Caroline Kennedy's behavior in the weeks following the crash, in the specific, chaotic, grief-saturated weeks when the bodies were being recovered and the memorials were being planned, and Ann Freeman was trying to exist in a world that no longer contained either of her daughters. These accounts have circulated for years. Callahan's research gives them a new level of documentation. Caroline Kennedy controlled the memorial. She controlled the guest list. She controlled the narrative of who John and Carolyn had been, and what their marriage had meant, and what the family had lost. She did this with the specific efficiency of a woman who had grown up inside the Kennedy institution and understood intuitively that narrative management in moments of grief was not separate from grief. It was the Kennedy family's primary mode of processing it. Ann Freeman was not given a central role in the planning of the memorial for her daughters. She was not invited to participate in decisions about how Carolyn and Lauren would be remembered publicly. She was present, she was there. She sat in the church. She bore the specific weight of being a mother at a memorial for two daughters in a church controlled by the family whose son had piloted the plane. But she was not at the center of what was supposed to be, in any meaningful sense, her daughter's funeral. The Kennedy family buried the Kennedys. And Ann Freeman, who had lost more than anyone else in the crash, who had given two daughters to a single July evening, who had signed a settlement that required her silence about a family that had treated her daughters as peripheral to their own story, sat in the church and watched. Now here is what happened after. In subsequent years, as the public memory of the crash settled into the cultural narrative of Kennedy tragedy, as John F. Kennedy Jr. became once again simply the most famous bachelor who ever lived, and then the most mourned Kennedy of his generation, Ann Freeman has lived with a grief that the world has never been particularly interested in. She is not a Kennedy. Her daughters were not Kennedys, not really, not in the way that the family and the press and the cultural mythology defined the term. They were women who had died alongside a Kennedy. And that distinction between dying alongside one and being one determined everything about how their loss was processed publicly. Ann Freeman's daughters have headstones. They are not in Arlington. They are not beside the eternal flame. They are in a cemetery in Massachusetts, in graves that are not part of any Kennedy mythology, visited by people who loved them rather than people who are maintaining a public legacy. This is not wrong. This is simply true. But it is worth saying clearly the women who died in that water deserved a grief that was equal to the grief for the man who was flying the plane. They did not receive it. In Part 7, I am going to tell you what I think Carolyn Bessette Kennedy actually was. Not Michael Bergin's version, not the Kennedy family's version, not the Ice Queen the tabloids invented. The actual woman, as close as the evidence allows us to get. And I am going to ask you one question about her that I think will stay with you long after this video ends. After everything after Michael Bergin's book, and Maureen Callahan's research, and the 3 pilots, and the settlement, and Ann Freeman in the church, I want to come back to the question of who Carolyn Bessette Kennedy actually was. Not the saint, not the villain, the person. She was a woman who grew up learning composure in Greenwich, who built herself genuinely, without inherited advantage, without a famous name from a showroom in Boston to the director of publicity at one of the most powerful fashion houses in America, who recognized, at 22, what the Calvin Klein world was and navigated it with a precision and intelligence that her employer publicly acknowledged as extraordinary. She was a woman who fell in love with Michael Bergin when she was 26 years old, who had a complicated on-and-off relationship with him that lasted years and overlapped messily with the beginning of her relationship with John, who was, by Bergin's own account, and by the accounts of people who knew her, capable of volatility, capable of cruelty in specific moments, capable of the specific self-protective aggression of someone who had learned very young that softness was a vulnerability. She was also a woman who turned John Kennedy down, twice, who made him wait 2 years before she said yes, who understood with the specific intelligence that everyone who knew her acknowledged exactly what she was agreeing to, and who agreed anyway, because she loved him. Not the name, not the mythology, the specific, complicated, careless, genuinely charming man who had pursued her for 2 years and who she had finally decided to trust. She was a woman who spent 1,028 days being called an ice queen by people who had never spoken to her, who was photographed, screaming at on public streets, and photographed being followed into grocery stores, and photographed having her most private moments consumed as entertainment by a world that had decided she was public property, because she had married someone famous. And she was a woman who in the end got into a plane she had said she did not want to board because her sister asked her to, because the Kennedy family had a wedding, because love and obligation, and the specific weight of 1,028 days of trying to be what that marriage required, all of it was heavier than her clearly stated reservation about the conditions. Michael Bergin's version of Carolyn Bessette Kennedy is not wrong about everything. She was complicated. She was difficult in specific ways. She was not a saint. But here is what Michael Bergin's version, and the Kennedy family's version, and the tabloid version, and every version that has been offered by someone with an interest in a particular conclusion consistently fails to do. It fails to ask what it would have cost any person to live that life, to be that public, to have that marriage, to lose that privacy, to perform composure for 1,028 days, in a world that was consuming every crack in it. Carolyn Bessette Kennedy was complicated, because life, specifically her life, was complicated. That is not a defense. It is simply the most accurate thing that can be said about any human being who has ever been reduced to a narrative. She was more than the narrative. She always was. What nobody said at Carolyn Bessette Kennedy's funeral. Nobody said that she had built herself without a famous name, and without inherited advantage, and without anyone opening doors for her that would not have opened on the basis of her own extraordinary capability. Nobody said that she had recognized, with complete clarity, what the Kennedy marriage would cost her, and had chosen it anyway, because love is not a transaction, and she was not, despite what Michael Bergin's book suggested, a woman who made her most important decisions on a calculating basis. Nobody said that she had spent 1,028 days being publicly consumed and privately diminished and institutionally managed by a family that had never fully accepted her and had done it with a composure that was not coldness. It was the only armor available to her. Nobody said that she had said she did not want to get on that plane, that she had been clear about it, that the decision to board was not hers in any meaningful sense. It was the accumulated weight of love and obligation and the specific loyalty to a sister who had asked her to come. Nobody said that Ann Freeman had lost both daughters and was sitting in a church where she had not been permitted to plan the memorial for either of them. Nobody said that the 3 pilots had warned John not to fly, and that he had flown anyway, and that the NTSB report was very precise about what that decision had produced. Nobody said any of this, because what was said at Carolyn Bessette Kennedy's funeral, like what was said about her for 1,028 days, before it was the version that served the interests of the people with the power to control what was said. She did not have that power. She never had that power. From the moment she agreed to marry John F. Kennedy Jr., from the moment she stepped into the frame of the most famous American family of the 20th century, Carolyn Bessette Kennedy's story belonged to everyone except her. And now, 25 years after the water, it still does. Michael Bergin's version, the Kennedy family's version, Maureen Callahan's version, Elizabeth Bella's version, this video's version. We are all still doing what the world did for 1,028 days, taking her story and making it mean what we need it to mean. The difference, the only difference that I can offer is this. This channel has never claimed that Carolyn Bessette Kennedy was a saint. It has never claimed she was a victim in the simple sense. It has claimed, and I will claim it again now, that she was a human being of extraordinary intelligence and extraordinary complexity, who was placed in an extraordinary situation and handled it with more grace than the situation deserved. She was not the Ice Queen. She was not Michael Bergin's volatile, calculating woman. She was not the Kennedy family's devoted outsider who simply could not cope. She was Carolyn Bessette, from Greenwich, from Boston University, from the Calvin Klein showroom where she had been so extraordinary that her employer publicly acknowledged it. A woman who loved complicated men and knew it and did it anyway. A woman who said she did not want to get on the plane. A woman who got on the plane because her sister asked her to. 1,028 days. And not a single one of them fully hers. Before you go, I want to ask you something. If you had been at that memorial on the 22nd of July, 1999, if you had been given 1 minute to stand up and say what nobody else was saying, what would you have said about Carolyn Bessette Kennedy? Leave your answer below. I read every single comment. If this moved you, please share it, because 25 years later, Ann Freeman is still alive. Her daughters are still in Massachusetts. And the world still knows Carolyn Bessette Kennedy primarily as a woman who could not handle being a Kennedy. She deserved better than that then. She still does. Next week we continue. A woman whose name you already know from this channel, whose connection to this story runs deeper than most people realize, and whose own experience of being managed and consumed and ultimately discarded by institutions more powerful than she was, will make everything you have heard in these 2 videos feel suddenly and uncomfortably familiar. Subscribe so you do not miss it. This is Mary of Shadows. Thank you for being here.